The fate of Europe may have been sealed the moment a newborn's arm was twisted in silence, and a mother's heart was torn between science and love. The winter air in Berlin was sharp on January 27, 1859. The city, wrapped in imperial calm, stood unaware that inside the halls of the royal palace, destiny was bleeding quietly through a screaming child. Friedrich Wilhelm Victor Albert, born to Victoria, Princess Royal of Great Britain, and Prince Friedrich of Prussia, entered the world not to silence and awe, but to a shriek that came too late and a silence that came too soon. The future Kaiser of Germany was born with a twisted arm, pulled too harshly by forceps, paralyzed from the shoulder down. The doctors were vague, the midwives were discreet. But the truth settled into the room like fog over a battlefield. The crown prince had been broken at birth. Victoria stared at her child with trembling disbelief. She was barely 19, herself the child of a queen, and yet already burdened with a weight she could not express. Her son, her heir, her symbol of union between Britain and Germany, was imperfect. In the court of Prussia, where symmetry and strength defined value, this was more than a medical accident. It was a cosmic insult. The court whispered. The generals looked away. The nurses avoided the arm. But Victoria could not. She was a daughter of modernity, of enlightenment, of progress. She had been raised in the glow of her father, Prince Albert's devotion to science and rationality. Weakness was to be corrected, not pitied. She believed in medicine, in discipline, in willpower. And so she set to work, not as a mother but as a reformer. The child was subjected to a regime of brutal therapies, ice-cold baths, metal braces, electric shocks, massage devices more suitable for animals than infants. Every morning began with the shriek of steel against skin. Victoria stood beside him, watching, believing. If he could be straightened, he could be saved. If he could be made strong, he could be emperor. If he could rise above pain, he could rise above destiny. But the child didn't see love. He saw a mother who watched without blinking, who measured his tears with clocks, who turned caresses into calibrations. He began to see her not as warmth, but as force. She who spoke English when others spoke German, who read poetry while others practiced drills, became to him an alien. Not a comfort, but a challenge. The Prussian court noticed. The boy once so loved in theory became a question in practice. His limp arm made him stand differently, move awkwardly, grip unevenly. The other children whispered. Teachers corrected his posture with disdain. And all the while Victoria pushed harder. His failures reflected on her. His struggle was hers to correct. She believed in idealism. He learned to hate it. As he grew, his identity split like a fractured mirror. On one side was the boy desperate to please his mother, to earn the smile that came only when he recited Byron in perfect diction or held his arm higher than it could go. On the other was the budding soldier, seduced by the cold perfection of Prussian military ritual. In the tight formation of a marching band, there was no room for brokenness. In the crack of boots on stone, there was no ambiguity, and in the eyes of his stern grandfather, Kaiser Wilhelm I, there was no space for sentiment. He began to idolize his grandfather, a man of war, steel, and certainty, a man who wore power like a second skin. In his presence, Wilhelm felt whole. In his mother's, he felt examined, loved but with condition, raised but under tension. She saw a mind to be cultivated. He saw a will to be resisted. As he approached adolescence, the conflict calcified. Victoria's lessons in British history, literature, and liberal philosophy began to taste like poison. Every time she mentioned constitutional monarchy, he recoiled. Every time she praised Parliament, he saw insult. To him, Britain had taken her away from him, replaced her soul with foreignness. Her laughter was too English, her principles too soft. He began to resent the tea, the books, the paintings, the servants who spoke in British accents. Her very presence became a reminder that he was not, could never be, fully Prussian. In a fateful moment that would later come to define their divide, she brought him a portrait of her father, Prince Albert, and placed it in his study. She told him he should grow to be like him, thoughtful, wise, devoted to reform and peace. The boy took the portrait, smiled politely, and later buried it in a closet behind trophies from his writing competitions. He didn't want to be a thinker. He wanted to be a ruler. He didn't want peace. He wanted power. In public, their relationship was ceremonial. In private, it was an undeclared war. Her letters became lectures. His replies, if any, were brief and cold. When she tried to embrace him, he stiffened. When she corrected his grammar, he exploded. And yet, neither could let go. She still believed he could be molded. He still needed her approval, even as he despised her authority. In moments of eerie calm, she would read the Psalms aloud to him. He would sit in silence, pretending not to listen, but memorizing every word. He never forgot the verses. He just buried them under armor. As Wilhelm approached adulthood, the world around him shifted. His grandfather, Kaiser Wilhelm I, was aging. His father, Friedrich, Victoria's husband, was next in line. But a quiet, intellectual man more in tune with Shakespeare than sabers. And then came the twist of fate that no one saw coming. Friedrich was diagnosed with throat cancer. A cruel irony. The voice of liberalism silenced before it could ever rule. Victoria was devastated. This was her last hope, her final attempt to realize the vision of a Germany that could be strong and civilized, united but not brutal, proud but not imperial. She nursed Friedrich with a devotion that broke her physically and spiritually. She begged Wilhelm to visit. He came once, stiff, formal, dismissive. His eyes flickered not with sorrow, but calculation. He knew his father would not rule long. He would be Kaiser, and when he did, the era of softness would end. As Friedrich lay dying, Wilhelm began assembling his court. Victoria watched, helpless. Her husband withered. Her son expanded. The empire she had dreamed of now stood on the edge of becoming something darker, a Germany without mercy, a son without soul, and yet she clung to hope. The way only mothers do, the way only queens never admit aloud. In the cold spring of 1888, Friedrich III died after ruling only 99 days. The throne passed to Wilhelm, the boy with the broken arm, the man with the unbroken rage. At the coronation, Victoria stood in a distant row, dressed in black. She was no longer mother, no longer consort, just a shadow, watching as her son raised the imperial orb with his right hand, and the entire world forgot the left. The crown settled on his head, the cheering echoed, and she quietly stepped away, out of the light, into the long silence that would define the rest of her life. The crown weighed heavily not because it was new, but because it was old, and Wilhelm wore it like armor against the ghosts of two empires. One was the empire he had just inherited, the German Empire, forged in iron and war, hungry for glory. The other was the invisible empire of expectation, the one his mother had tried to build inside him, brick by brick, principle by principle. Now that he was Kaiser, he intended to demolish it. His first act was not of vision, but of erasure. Everything that bore the fingerprints of his parents' liberalism was swept away. Advisors who spoke of constitutional checks were replaced with sycophants fluent in obedience. Court decorum shifted overnight. German became the sole language of courtly discourse. English accents were discouraged, then mocked. Paintings of British monarchs were quietly removed. In their place hung grand oil portraits of Prussian kings in full military regalia, swords drawn, gazes cold. The palace, once echoing with philosophical discussion and quiet reform, now thundered with drills, medals, and marches. Victoria watched in quiet horror from the castle Friedrichshof, a place she had once envisioned as a sanctuary of enlightenment. Her letters to Wilhelm continued, now tinged with desperation instead of correction. But she sensed the final curtain had fallen. The boy she had raised was gone, not transformed, but armored, hardened. The empathy she had tried to kindle had become a forge for pride. Wilhelm, now in the prime of his authority, began to reinvent himself, not as the heir to German constitutionalism, but as its conqueror. He cast himself as the embodiment of divine right, a modern Caesar anointed by destiny. He was not merely German. He was history's response to British arrogance, French decay, and Russian superstition, and he intended to make sure the world knew it. But he remained a prince between two thrones, not just politically but psychically. Though he buried his British heritage in public, in private it haunted him. On his desk sat a miniature portrait of his grandmother, Queen Victoria. He never admitted who placed it there. It was always turned slightly away, as if she watched from the corner, silently judging. In his dreams, he sometimes heard his mother's voice quoting Locke or Burke, but when he awoke, he dismissed them with disdain. The truth he would never admit. The voice still lived in him, even as he denied its meaning. The ghost of England loomed largest during state visits. Wilhelm toured Europe with pomp and fire, but every trip to England became a theater of tension. When he visited his British cousins, the sons and daughters of Queen Victoria, he wore the smile of royalty, but beneath it burned resentment. He was treated as a curiosity, not as an equal. They whispered about his arm. They laughed at his uniforms. They mocked his speeches in private. And he knew it. The hurt never faded. Once, during a banquet in Windsor, a cousin offhandedly referred to him as our German Wilhelm, and he responded by giving a toast in French, deliberately excluding English entirely. It was a petty gesture, but in his mind, it was war. Every insult, real or imagined, fed his belief that England saw him as a crippled boy pretending to be king. He would show them. He would build a fleet that rivaled the Royal Navy. He would command respect not with lineage, but with steel, and so the arms race began. Germany, once a land of poets and professors, became a land of dreadnoughts and discipline. Wilhelm poured resources into naval expansion, triggering a cold alarm across the English Channel. British newspapers responded with cartoons of a wild-eyed Kaiser draped in cannons. Victoria, had she lived, would have recognized the absurdity, but she was no longer there to protest. In the vacuum she left, Wilhelm filled the silence with noise. He delivered flamboyant speeches filled with religious fervor and imperial bombast. He told crowds that the German people were chosen by God, that destiny flowed through their veins, that history would be written in German or not at all. The crowds cheered, the ministers winced, the diplomats scrambled. Behind the curtain, his court had begun to fracture. While Wilhelm believed himself to be the orchestrator of a new world order, many of his own generals saw him as a liability. He was unpredictable. One day he demanded friendship with Britain. The next he accused them of betrayal. His ministers often received contradicting orders within the same week. His need to be admired overwhelmed strategy. He lived for headlines, not treaties. Yet the German people for a time adored him. He was young. He was grand. He looked the part. And in an age that worshipped appearance, image often triumphed over substance. He staged naval reviews with thousands of sailors, orchestrated parades where he rode in front alone, and issued edicts printed in gilded fonts. He was spectacle incarnate. But beneath the plumes and medals lay a truth he never escaped. He was always performing, even to himself. There were moments, rare and unspoken, when the mask cracked. During a hunting retreat in the Bavarian Alps, a servant once reported seeing Wilhelm standing alone for hours by a lake, holding a small weathered notebook. It was Victoria's journal, the servant later claimed. Whether true or legend, the image remained. The world's most powerful man, staring into still water, haunted by the woman who tried to shape his soul. Marriage did not soften him. He wed Augusta Victoria of Schleswig-Holstein, a woman of gentle piety and conventional obedience. She was everything his mother was not: quiet, deferential, undemanding. In public, she smiled and stood beside him. In private, she watched him unravel in silence. She bore him children, tended to his moods, and prayed for his soul. But she never reached him. No one did. Wilhelm's heart was a palace with locked wings, rooms sealed off long before he understood why. His children feared him. His ministers tiptoed around him. His enemies misunderstood him. But only one person had truly known him, and she was gone. Victoria had not merely raised a son, she had constructed a paradox. In trying to give him the strength to lead, she taught him to despise the gentleness that made strength human. In trying to educate him for peace, she equipped him to weaponize ideas. In trying to mold a philosopher king, she built an emperor desperate to be feared. As Europe entered the 20th century, Wilhelm stood like a bridge between centuries, one foot in the past, one in the abyss. He saw the world shifting beneath his feet, revolutions stirring, machines replacing men, empires beginning to rot, and yet he clung to the pageantry of old. He saw the British monarchy adapting to democracy with grace and hated them more for it. In his eyes, compromise was cowardice, flexibility was failure, and modernity was treason. His speeches became darker. He began to invoke not just God, but vengeance. He spoke of enemies within and without. He used the language of cleansing, of destiny, of thunder. In his gaze, one could see the child still desperate to be praised, the man determined to punish those who hadn't. In the back halls of the palace, old servants still spoke of Victoria. Some remembered her tears, her soft reprimands, her long walks alone with books tucked under her arm. Others recalled how she used to watch Wilhelm from balconies, whispering lines of poetry as he passed, hoping he'd turn to look. He rarely did, and yet something in him remained tethered. When the British ambassador arrived to deliver formal greetings, Wilhelm would scowl, but always stood for God save the Queen. When asked why, he would answer with a phrase he never explained. You stand for what shapes you, even if you despise the form. The world did not know what to make of him. To some, he was the modern Alexander. To others, a petulant actor with a saber. But to those who had truly watched him grow, there was another truth. Wilhelm was not just Germany's emperor. He was Victoria's unfinished symphony, louder than intended, darker than composed, but echoing with the chords she struck long ago. As the decade closed and Europe drifted toward the edge of catastrophe, Wilhelm stood at the center of a storm not yet visible. He thought he had transcended his mother, but in reality, he had merely become the echo of her absence. The prince between two thrones was now an emperor without a mirror, and the world was watching. The year 1888 came cloaked in mourning, but beneath its veil lay ambition. Germany called it the Year of Three Emperors, a title history would wear like a funeral sash. Wilhelm I, the Iron Patriarch who had held the empire together with sheer will, passed away in March. His death was inevitable. His successor, Friedrich III, had been long prepared. The crown was to pass peacefully, but peace in that year had no intention of lasting. Friedrich ascended the throne with the soul of a philosopher and the voice of a ghost. Throat cancer had seized him before the crown could grace his head. For years, his gentle voice had carried the ideals he shared with his wife, Victoria: reform, moderation, constitutional dignity. Now it had been reduced to hoarse whispers and scribbled notes. He ruled in silence, and in that silence, his son listened with sharpened ears. Wilhelm watched his father's decline with a curious blend of calculation and grief. He had never understood Friedrich. His father's kindness had felt distant. His books were heavier than his presence. He loved deeply, but gently, and Wilhelm, raised amid hardness, mistook gentleness for failure. Yet as Friedrich coughed his way through state papers, hunched in robes instead of armor, Wilhelm began to realize something chilling. The man who stood between him and ultimate power was dying, and behind that man stood Victoria. She had waited her entire life for this moment, not to rule, but to influence. Her letters to Friedrich were now legislative blueprints. Her afternoons were spent in diplomatic meetings, her evenings in strategy. She planned quietly, but precisely. The reign of Friedrich, though born in illness, could still be a triumph of principle. But Wilhelm saw something else. He saw a mother becoming monarch in all but name. A woman he had spent his youth resisting was now inches from the throne. In her hands were policy drafts, ambassadorial appointments, royal decrees. In his, only waiting, watching, seething. At court, the atmosphere turned electric. Ministers loyal to Bismarck's old regime began whispering that Victoria was overstepping, that the Empress was English in thought, English in instinct, English in disloyalty. Her accent became a weapon. Her manners, once admired, were now scrutinized. And Wilhelm, carefully, quietly, let the rumors spread. Victoria noticed, but she had fought harder battles. She remembered the icy corridors of Buckingham Palace, The quiet humiliations of being married off to a foreign court, the years of bearing children in a language that was not her own. She had built her life on resilience, and she would not yield now, not when she stood so close to seeing Germany turn toward light. And then came the 99th day. Friedrich died as he had lived, in grace, in sorrow, and largely unrecognized. The newspapers mourned him with polite brevity. There was no parade, no thunder of cannons, just black ribbons on flags and the sudden rush of boots down palace halls. Wilhelm had become Kaiser. The boy with the twisted arm was now the man with the scepter. His first act was to erase. He dismissed nearly every advisor tied to his father's short reign. The liberal ministers were reassigned, retired, or publicly humiliated. The military regained its throne in the emperor's favor. Bismarck, once in political exile, was called back to court. The message was clear. The experiment with softness had ended. Victoria was still in mourning when she received word that Friedrich's private journals were being reviewed, not for preservation, but redaction. Wilhelm did not want the public reading of a ruler who questioned militarism, who doubted war, who called for a federal constitution. History would remember Friedrich, but only in the silhouette Wilhelm approved. Victoria confronted her son, through letters, through intermediaries, through silence. But Wilhelm had mastered the art of avoidance. He smiled at her in public, kissed her hand before banquets, but in private he built walls. Thick, high, ceremonial walls. He stripped her of influence slowly, so that none could accuse him of cruelty, only efficiency. He knew the power she had once held, and he knew how to dissolve it, inch by inch. She retreated to Friedrichshof, the estate built in memory of her late husband. There she surrounded herself with books, correspondence, and the last remnants of a vision that had failed. She still received dignitaries, still wrote letters of philosophical depth, still advised other members of the royal family, but her son no longer answered. The line had been cut. What passed between them now was only posture, but the empire needed more than posture. Wilhelm, hungry to assert himself beyond his mother's shadow, threw himself into performance. State visits multiplied, uniforms expanded. He posed in naval coats one day, hunting dress the next, and academic robes by Sunday. He became everything to everyone, except consistent. His speeches, once written with care by seasoned statesmen, became erratic showcases of ego. He warned of German destiny, divine right, the sins of socialism, the treachery of England. Diplomats flinched, crowds roared, and in the quiet corners of Europe, alarm bells began to ring. In the drawing rooms of Friedrichshof, Victoria heard them too. She still had allies. In Britain, Queen Victoria, her mother, watched with increasing dismay as Wilhelm alienated cousins, insulted Parliament, and built ships to rival the Royal Navy. In Russia, she sent careful letters to Tsarina Maria Feodorovna, urging moderation in alliances. But the world had changed. Monarchs no longer whispered decisions. Newspapers did. The age of quiet diplomacy was dying. The age of spectacle had begun. And Wilhelm was its perfect child. In the shadows, he admired Napoleon, not the man, but the myth, the image of strength, the silhouette of fear. He studied Roman emperors, commissioned statues, encouraged comparisons. He wanted to be a new Charlemagne, a new Frederick the Great, but he also wanted his mother to see it, to admire it, to regret her doubts. She never gave him that. Instead, she wrote him a final letter, unpublished, unseen until decades later. In it, she spoke not of disappointment, but of sorrow, not of failure, but of blindness. She wrote of the day he was born, of the first time he held her finger, of how his tiny hand, though twisted, gripped with strength beyond measure. She wrote that she had not raised a king. She had raised a battleground, and now she feared the war was just beginning. Wilhelm never replied. But he kept the letter. The years that followed were filled with noise, political crises, diplomatic blunders, naval escalations. Wilhelm alienated Britain, confused Russia, provoked France. He declared that Germany needed its place in the sun, unaware, or perhaps too aware, that the sun often burns what it touches. Victoria's health declined. She was diagnosed with breast cancer. Treatment was limited, pain constant. Her final months were spent in the same silence her husband had endured. The palace staff noted how she often sat by the window, staring toward the west, lips moving in prayer or recitation. Sometimes she whispered her son's name, sometimes only his title, but never both. When she died in 1901, the court observed the expected mourning. Wilhelm wore black, delivered a speech. He praised her intelligence, her charity, her unique position between nations. But his eyes betrayed nothing. And in private, he returned quickly to business. No state funeral, no monuments, no cathedral processions, only silence. But history does not bury the living so easily. For the next decade, as Wilhelm ruled and posed and thundered, her image would return. Not in portraits, but in mirrors. In every failed treaty, she echoed. In every British insult, she whispered. In every moment of doubt, she lingered. The boy she had tried to build became the man who tried to erase her. But the crown he wore was not just Prussian iron, it was her crown too, a crown of thorns. She had been gone for a decade, and yet Victoria's absence clung to Wilhelm's empire like morning frost, silent, persistent, and biting. As the 20th century awakened across Europe, the Kaiser was at the height of his power, but the woman who once sought to shape his soul had become his invisible judge. No monument bore her name. No street in Berlin honored her memory. And yet, in every speech he made, in every fleet he launched, she was there. Beneath the bravado, beneath the brass. Not as presence, but pressure. Wilhelm was now fully the Kaiser he had dreamed of becoming. The crown was no longer borrowed, it was fused to his identity. The German Empire bent to his rhythm. Steel, uniform, order, progress. He had forged an empire of motion, trains slicing through valleys, warships slicing through oceans, industry pounding out the beat of ambition. And at its center stood a man desperate to be remembered, not as a son, but as a symbol. But the symbol was cracking. Though Germany glittered in industrial might, Wilhelm's diplomacy wobbled like a glass sword. His instincts were reactive, impulsive, and untempered by the restraint his mother once embodied. He surrounded himself with flatterers, men who reinforced his fantasies rather than challenge his follies. Foreign ministers came and went like seasons. Treaties were signed, then contradicted. One day he praised England as kin. The next he denounced it as a decadent empire of shopkeepers. It was in these moments, after the cheers had faded, when only paper and pen remained, that Victoria's shadow returned. He still kept her letters, tucked in a velvet-bound volume with no title. Occasionally he read them, not out of affection, but inspection, searching for weakness, for judgment, for prophecy. He always found all three. Germany's foreign policy began to mirror the Kaiser's inner world. Erratic, grandiose, resentful. He felt surrounded, encircled. Britain, France, and Russia drifted ever closer in alliance. A triad Wilhelm saw not as diplomacy, but betrayal. He blamed everyone but himself. The diplomats were cowards, the generals too cautious, the parliament too meddlesome. And above them all, he blamed the English. The same nation that had once defined his upbringing now defined his vengeance. And yet the contradiction clung to him. He could never quite sever the cord. He still wore British medals. He still invited British royals to Berlin, even as he prepared against their fleet. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, he traveled to her funeral, stood beside his cousin Edward VII, and wept. Not for the monarch, but perhaps for the last fragile link to the woman he had spent his life resisting. Back in Germany, his public persona hardened. He adopted the image of the Weltpolitik emperor, a global ruler determined to secure Germany's place in the sun. Colonial ambitions intensified. The Navy expanded with staggering speed, challenging Britain's supremacy at sea. His speeches brimmed with fire, divine destiny, racial superiority, the glory of iron and empire. He was not just leading Germany, he was lifting it onto the world stage, alone if necessary. But every crusade begins with a ghost. Privately, Wilhelm began to speak of legacy, not in terms of policy, but permanence. He wanted his name etched into the earth, not just the record. He commissioned statues, libraries, naval bases that bore his initials. He ordered portraits of himself on horseback, in gilded armor, eyes fixed on eternity. And yet, none of these images erase the quieter ones. A frail child in a brace, a mother's stern gaze, a letter unopened. The public began to notice the drift. In 1905, during the First Moroccan crisis, Wilhelm made a bold and reckless declaration in support of Moroccan independence, intended to undermine French influence. The move backfired catastrophically, uniting France and Britain more closely. The chasm between his intentions and results widened. Newspapers in Paris mocked him as le comédien du pouvoir. British caricaturists drew him as a jester in a helmet. He fumed. He thundered. But inside, the boy wounded by ridicule still lived. And he still heard his mother's voice, somewhere between memory and myth. Not in words, but in tension. She had always feared this, an emperor guided by image, not intellect. A ruler too enamored with mirrors to see maps. Wilhelm once insisted he was not his mother's creation. Yet in moments of crisis, her principles haunted his conscience like a chime he couldn't silence. At court, his mood darkened. Those closest to him noted sudden eruptions of anger, followed by eerie quiet. He dismissed advisors with increasing frequency. His inner circle became a hall of distorted reflections, each man amplifying his certainties. Criticism was treason, doubt, betrayal. He once told a confidant that his greatest flaw was trusting people who thought they were smarter than their Kaiser. It was a confession wrapped in accusation. Augusta Victoria, his wife, now spent more time in religious retreat. Her quiet prayers were no match for Wilhelm's roaring insecurities. Their children, particularly the crown prince, watched with growing distance. The throne had become an island, and Wilhelm Tedihira's lone inhabitant. And yet, amid all the posturing, a paradox unfolded. Wilhelm began writing essays, long, wandering meditations on statecraft, war, Christianity, and race. These writings were not for publication, they were for himself, and within them, fragments of doubt emerged. He questioned modernity, lamented moral decline, and warned of spiritual decay in Europe. These were not the words of a general. They were echoes, faint but undeniable, of Victoria's warnings decades earlier. He never named her, but the cadence was hers, the concern, the fear of rot beneath the pageantry. And in one of his unpublished reflections, he wrote, "A nation without soul is a machine without fire. My mother warned me once of the cold silence that comes when power forgets its purpose." The irony was suffocating. While Wilhelm preached strength, he sensed decay. While he built ships, he feared storms. And while he commanded nations, he remained the son of a woman who had tried, desperately, to give him something no crown could offer: inner ballast. By 1912, Europe stood like a chessboard in mid-game, pieces placed, tensions taut. Wilhelm, though still loud, found himself increasingly sidelined by generals and statesmen more grounded than grandiose. His outbursts were filtered, his speeches edited. The world he once dominated had learned to mute him, and yet in his solitude, the shadows lengthened. He began dreaming, dreams he never recounted, but servants heard his cries. Aides found him staring into the fire for hours. In the royal library, he requested volumes long untouched, books of liberal theory, letters from his father, medical journals from England. Perhaps he was revisiting the roots. Perhaps he was seeking closure. Or perhaps he was trying, at last, to understand the woman whose crown of thorns had pricked him so deeply. But the world outside had no time for healing. In the Balkans, alliances cracked. In Russia, sabers rattled. In France, plans were drawn. The age of kings was narrowing, and Wilhelm, in all his splendor and sorrow, was drifting toward a conflict that would render everything, his fleets, his titles, even his crown, irrelevant. Yet before the guns of August roared, there was one more whisper from the past. On the 25th anniversary of his ascension, a modest British historian published a short pamphlet reflecting on Friedrich Thirth. In it, the author praised Victoria's vision, her efforts to temper Prussian militarism, her warnings about unchecked nationalism. The piece barely made waves, but Wilhelm read it. He ordered copies confiscated. The historian was banned from further access to German archives. And the next day in his diary, Wilhelm wrote only one line: "She still speaks." The wind was changing, and Wilhelm stood at the prow of his empire like a man convinced the storm was proof of his strength. The old alliances were unraveling. The map of Europe trembled beneath unsteady fingers. And the Kaiser, now in the third decade of his rule, mistook this tremor for opportunity. With his mother long buried and her cautious influence buried deeper, Wilhelm no longer whispered about power. He wielded it like a saber, shiny and unwieldy. The system of checks that once surrounded the German throne, parliamentary resistance, ministerial pushback, royal moderation, had thinned into theatrical gestures. He was now, more than ever, the beating heart of the empire's ambitions. And the rhythm was accelerating. He believed himself a conductor of destiny. Speeches grew longer, audiences more deferential. He often stood before the Reichstag and thundered about Germany's place in the sun, warning the old empires of Europe that a new lion stalked their colonial territories. Naval fleets roared from Kiel to Cameroon. Flags were raised on foreign sands. The world was watching, and that was exactly how Wilhelm liked it. But beneath the surface of triumph, the cracks widened. The German military elite had learned how to navigate his moods, agree in person, adapt in policy. The foreign ministry kept two versions of every speech, the one the Kaiser gave and the one the world needed to hear. At banquets, ministers passed notes beneath the table, warning one another to change topics when Wilhelm's tone began to rise. They had become courtiers not to a monarch, but to a tempest. Still, the German people adored him. He was visible, loud, larger than life. He rode through Berlin on white horses, adorned with medals that glittered like false prophecy. He christened battleships with names of myth and glory. In school books, children read of his divine calling. In newspapers, his silhouette towered over diplomacy. But Wilhelm no longer ruled with vision. He ruled with theater, and the stage was shifting. In 1914, a shot rang out in Sarajevo. An archduke fell, and the world began to slide. At first, Wilhelm saw the crisis in the Balkans as a familiar dance of threats and treaties, one more arena for Germany to assert dominance. Austria-Hungary, Germany's fragile ally, looked to him for reassurance. Wilhelm offered it without hesitation. He gave them what history would later call the blank check, a promise of unconditional German support should war erupt. He had no plan, only pride. What followed was not decision, but drift. As the weeks of July unfolded, empires moved as though pulled by invisible chains. Mobilizations became ultimatums. Ultimatums became declarations. And suddenly the world was at war, not through deliberate will, but collective failure. In Berlin, Wilhelm found himself both monarch and bystander. His generals seized the initiative. War plans, long prepared, rigid and merciless, began moving without pause. The Schlieffen Plan, a strategy to crush France quickly through Belgium, was activated with barely a nod to diplomacy. Germany invaded. Britain declared war. The die was cast, and Wilhelm realized too late that the empire no longer answered only to him. The war was not his to control. It was a beast fed by artillery and blood, no longer contained by throne or treaty. Yet still he posed. He rode through fields in ornate uniforms, visited wounded soldiers with rehearsed sorrow, and signed documents no longer written in his voice. The Kaiser was fading into iconography, grand but hollow. What the public did not see was the rot behind the marble. Wilhelm's confidence wavered. Reports from the front were sanitized, then censored, then ignored altogether. Losses were blamed on betrayal, on fate, on the disobedience of others. He spoke of treachery within his own government. He grew suspicious of ministers, of journalists, even of his own son. He accused his advisors of disloyalty, his generals of defeatism. The court, once a circle of glittering obedience, had become a minefield of paranoia. But the greatest betrayal had already happened. The war, far from uniting Germany under imperial glory, had revealed its fragility. Supplies dwindled. Hunger crept through cities. The people who once cheered his name now cursed it in breadlines. The myth of the all-powerful Kaiser began to crack. And still, in the privacy of his chambers, Wilhelm returned to his journals. He began writing again, not decrees, not doctrine, but reflections. Late into the night, he scrawled pages of contradiction, blaming the British, lamenting the war, invoking divine wrath, remembering childhood. He quoted scripture, he quoted Bismarck, and sometimes he quoted his mother, not by name, never aloud, but her voice, the one he had spent a lifetime drowning out, returned now in whispers between cannon fire. He wrote of spiritual corrosion, of a nation without moral compass. He even scribbled, half-faded, one bitter line, "If only she had believed in iron. If only I had believed in her." No one saw those pages. They would be found decades later, stained with candle wax, tucked behind photographs of his horse and fleet. As the war dragged on, Wilhelm's role diminished. The generals, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, became the true power. The Kaiser became a face on currency, a statue in city squares, a myth maintained for morale. His decisions mattered less. His presence became ceremonial. He was unbound and yet irrelevant. His mother's greatest fear had come true. Not that he would become a tyrant, but that he would become empty. And still, the war burned. In 1917, the United States entered the conflict. In 1918, German morale collapsed. The spring offensive failed. Revolution stirred in the streets. Soldiers mutinied. Workers rioted. The empire, once proclaimed eternal, began to fold inward. And Wilhelm, once so certain of his divine purpose, stood paralyzed. He offered peace too late. He spoke of abdication too slowly. He fled the capital in disguise, arriving at the Dutch border as a monarch without a country. In the final days, he sent messages to the army, to his ministers, to his people. But one message remained unsent, a letter addressed to Victoria, left unfinished. It began, "You were right about the cost of glory, but you never told me how lonely it would be." He never completed it. The world outside had moved on. The war ended. The empire died. The Kaiser, once unbound, now belonged to no one. Not to Germany, not to history, and not even to the memory he had tried so desperately to shape. Only the silence remained, and in that silence, her voice lingered still. The cannon stopped, but the silence was not peace. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, Wilhelm sat alone in the cold drawing room of Huisdoorn, a manor in the Netherlands that smelled of mothballs and fading velvet. He had fled Germany days earlier, disguised in a civilian coat, his train journey marked not by cheers but by indifference. The man who once claimed the divine right to rule 60 million souls now waited in exile for permission to stay in a foreign land. No army saluted, no anthem played. His crown had not shattered in a grand crescendo. It had evaporated between telegrams. And yet Wilhelm still believed, if only briefly, that history might grant him a second act. He imagined returning in triumph. He dreamed of rallies, of crowds begging for stability, of generals calling him back to restore order. He fantasized that the Republic would falter, that the people would remember who built their fleet, who expanded their empire, who stood tall in the photographs of victory, even if there had been none. But the months passed, then the years, and the world forgot. Germany did not call, the empire was gone, and the emperor was a footnote. At Huisdoorn, he constructed a museum of himself. The rooms were filled with portraits of Prussian kings, busts of Roman emperors, photographs of naval reviews, and relics from a world that had collapsed. His servants were instructed to maintain courtly protocol. Titles were still used, boots still polished, timetables still observed. Breakfast at 9, letters dictated at 11, garden walks at precisely 4. It was monarchy by ritual, not relevance. And still, each night, he returned to his writing. The notebooks multiplied, volumes of rage, memory, delusion, and confession. He blamed Britain for the war, the Jews for the revolution, the generals for betrayal, the press for poison. He railed against democracy, called the Weimar Republic a disease, and spoke of history as though it were a battlefield that had simply forgotten to report his victories. But within the fury, something else stirred. Ghosts. Victoria. Her voice returned not as reprimand, but as mirror. In his quietest hours, he wrote not as emperor, but as son. His prose shifted, less thunder, more shadow. He quoted her letters often from memory. He recalled her criticisms, her silences, her sermons about duty and restraint. In one passage, he admitted, "She foresaw the fall, not in weapons, but in words, not in politics, but in pride." No one read those lines. Not then. His exile stretched from months into years. He aged, but not gracefully. The once proud mustache sagged. His limp, once concealed by posture, now defined his walk. His hands, once raised in theatrical blessing, now trembled. And the world outside moved on without him. The German Republic struggled, then stabilized. New parties rose. New flags flew. Children grew up never hearing his name. His birthday passed without mention. Even his enemies stopped mocking him. There was no need. History had already closed the book. And yet, he refused to let go. Each morning he dressed as emperor. Each night he dreamed in black and white. Marches, parades, thrones. Sometimes he called for Victoria. Not loudly, not in madness, but softly, as though inviting her ghost to dinner. Augusta Victoria, his wife, died in 1921. Her absence deepened his solitude. He remarried a younger woman, Hermine, who flattered him and maintained the illusion of court life. But even she could not bridge the silence that lingered behind the walls. Wilhelm no longer ruled a nation. He ruled a mausoleum. Then came the drums again. In 1933, Germany crowned a new kind of ruler, not with a crown, but with fire. Adolf Hitler rose not through bloodlines, but ballots. He wore no sash, bore no title of king. But Wilhelm watched him with wary curiosity. At first he smiled. Perhaps this was the return. Perhaps this man, crude but powerful, would restore Germany's pride and his own relevance. But Hitler had no interest in emperors. He used Wilhelm as a relic, not a reference. There would be no restoration, no throne, no second coming. And Wilhelm knew it. He congratulated Hitler in letters, made public gestures of support, but never embraced the man. In private, he called the Nazi uniforms garish, and their salute a mockery of discipline. He criticized the destruction of Jewish homes, but blamed the victims. He understood power only in the image of himself, and Hitler was too foreign, too wild, too modern to mirror back anything familiar. The final insult came in silence. When the Third Reich declared war in 1939, no message came to Dorn, no envoy, no salute. The empire had returned in form, but not in name, and the emperor remained irrelevant. In his final year, Wilhelm grew quiet. His writing slowed, his walk shortened, the fire in his eyes dimmed, but the ghost remained, Victoria most of all. One morning, a servant found him sitting in the garden, holding a yellowed envelope. It was unopened. The address read, "For my son, should he ever wish to listen." He had kept it for decades. That afternoon, he asked to be left alone. The next day, June 4th, 1941, he died in his sleep. No trumpets, no procession. The world was at war, but not for him. His funeral was held at Huisdorn. A small crowd gathered, former officers, distant relatives, loyalists from a vanished era. There were no heads of state, no imperial banners, only a gray sky and the rustle of wind through pine. He was buried in uniform, but the crown had long since dissolved, and in the end, all that remained was her voice, not an accusation, but an echo. It began with silence, not fire. The fall of the House of Hohenzollern came not as a revolution on palace steps, nor as a bullet in a basement. There was no Bastille stormed, no red flag hoisted on balcony railings. There was only the quiet hum of disinterest, of a people moving forward without a backward glance. And at the center of that neglect sat Wilhelm, once emperor of Europe's most feared empire, now reduced to a caretaker of memory, leafing through the crumbling pages of a past that no one wanted to read. After his death in 1941, there was no funeral procession through the Brandenburg Gate, no gathering of royals beneath Gothic arches. His body was lowered into a Dutch garden by aging hands and forgotten titles. He had requested not to be buried in Germany unless the monarchy was restored. That day would never come. The empire had not just vanished, it had been dissolved, atomized, swept away by its own delusions. The iron pillars that once held up the Reichstag had rusted under the acid of 2 world wars. The generals, the ministers, the uniforms, the bloodlines, all now scattered into the winds of modernity. And the Hohenzollerns, whose name had once rolled across maps like a storm front, were now relics of trivia, footnotes to treaties they no longer signed. Germany, the country they once ruled with edicts and oaths, had fractured. First into a republic, then into rubble, then into zones of occupation. The eagle no longer soared above cities. The Prussian cadence had been drowned out by Soviet boots, American jazz, and the quiet resolve of a people too broken to remember where the march began. And yet, in the manor house at Dorn, the past clung to its rituals. Even after Wilhelm's death, his widow Hermine preserved the illusion. Meals were served at courtly hours. Visitors were greeted with stiff curtsies and titles borrowed from dust. The halls remained filled with relics, bronze busts of Friedrich the Great, velvet cushions embroidered with the imperial W, ceremonial swords whose blades had not drawn blood in decades. It was a museum without entry, a monarchy without kingdom, a cathedral to a vanished god. Occasionally, loyalists visited, a colonel from Bavaria, a scholar from Leipzig. They spoke in hushed voices, tiptoeing through the corridors as though afraid to wake history. They brought flowers, books, sometimes rumors. One whispered that the monarchy would be restored after the Americans left. Another swore that secret royalist cells were preparing a return. But none believed their own words. They came not for prophecy, but pilgrimage. Meanwhile, in Germany, the name Hohenzollern faded from the mouths of schoolchildren and the pages of new history books. The Reichstag rose again, this time under democratic banners. Streets once named for emperors were renamed for poets, philosophers, and martyrs of resistance. The black and white portraits that once adorned every schoolhouse were replaced by color photographs of chancellors and construction cranes. But history does not vanish. It settles. In archives and attics, in photo albums and state letters, the ghost of empire still lingered. And within that ghost, the specter of Wilhelm loomed, not as a ruler, but as a caution. His reign was now studied not for inspiration, but for warning. His failures became case studies. His speeches, once thunderous, were dissected for delusion. He was no longer the architect of Germany's might. He was its mirror in crisis. And yet, even in his irrelevance, something endured. A single thread, frayed but unbroken. Her, Victoria, long dead, long exiled in memory, but still present, like the scent of lavender in a closed room. She had outlived her influence, but not her significance. In the private writings of Wilhelm, uncovered decades after his death, historians found references not just to his mother's ideals, but to her voice, how he had spent his life trying to silence it, and how it had become the one he could not unhear. She had written once, "Empires fall not when they are defeated, but when they forget why they began." He never quoted her directly in public. But that sentence, its cadence, its ache, appeared again and again in his post-exile reflections, sometimes almost word for word, sometimes merely as shadow. The fall of the Hohenzollerns, then, was not just political. It was intimate. It was the slow erosion of conviction, the surrender of belief, the realization that bloodlines were not bulwarks against change. Wilhelm had built monuments. Victoria had planted seeds. His crumbled. Hers endured in silence. The modern world had no room for empires, but it did remember mothers. Victoria, who had once been hated for her English manners, mocked for her liberal ideals, dismissed as a foreign intruder in a militaristic court, was now seen with different eyes. Later biographies recast her not as a failed queen, but as a foresighted woman. A mother who tried to teach mercy in an age obsessed with strength, a voice of moderation in a house built on force. And Wilhelm? He became finally a figure of contradiction, not merely a warmonger, nor a madman, nor a puppet, but a son. A boy shaped by a birth injury and a mother's perfectionism. A man who rejected the very lessons he carried within. An emperor who ruled by instinct, but was haunted by intellect. His downfall was not written in treaties or trenches. It was written in the spaces between silence and shadow. In the long, unspoken war between who he was and who she hoped he'd become. By the time the Berlin Wall rose, few remembered his voice, and by the time it fell, even fewer remembered his face. But one thing remained, the echo of an empire built on iron, and the echo beneath it, softer, older, unyielding. The voice of the woman who tried to warn him. He outlived her. He outlived the empire. But in the end, it was her voice that remained. The decades unraveled slowly after Wilhelm's death. Europe had burned twice, reshaped itself in fire and surrender, then settled into a tense, fractured calm. The cities he once paraded through now bore scars deeper than any battle hymn could mend. The boulevards no longer echoed with the click of military boots, but with construction, traffic, and questions. Germany had not just survived him, it had grown without him. And in that absence, the story of Wilhelm took its final shape. Not on marble plaques or royal decrees, but in textbooks, in whispered reflections, in the cautionary gaze of scholars peering into the machinery of fallen empires. He had once imagined his name etched into the bones of the world. Instead, he became an ellipsis, a pause before the age of chaos, a prelude to the darkness he could neither prevent nor control. The archives opened, the letters released, and with them came a revelation not of statecraft or scandal, but of sadness. In the pages left behind, among military memoranda and proclamations of imperial ambition, were confessions, some clear, some buried in metaphor, scattered notes in the margins of speeches, fragments of poetry rewritten in his hand, half-finished drafts that no one had seen, and through them ran a thread as unmistakable as it was unexpected. Victoria. Her presence, long denied in life, returned in death not as forgiveness, but as a lens. He had never rebuilt her image in public. He never commissioned a statue, never honored her name in ceremony. But in his journals, she appeared again and again. Sometimes as a critic, sometimes a silhouette, sometimes simply as she, the mother, the exile, the ghost, the compass he had spent a lifetime trying to bury, and in doing so, became forever tethered to. History had already judged them both. Victoria, once reviled in Prussian circles as the English woman who spoke too softly and thought too deeply, was now revisited with new understanding. In an age where monarchs were remembered less for battles than for principles, she stood unexpectedly tall. Her letters revealed not manipulation, but foresight. Her attempts to guide Wilhelm, once seen as overreach, were now viewed as a desperate act of salvation. She had tried to teach him that leadership required restraint. He thought it required applause. She had spoken of the dignity of loss. He chased the illusion of invincibility. And in the end, her warnings became prophecy. But this was not her victory. It was their tragedy. The House of Hohenzollern, like so many dynasties before it, was buried not by defeat, but by disconnection. A crown passed from father to son, severed by a mother's ideals, a lineage unbroken by war, undone by misunderstanding. The fall had not come with revolution, but with rupture, between generations, between philosophies, between love and expectation. And yet legacy is not always found where we plant it. In a university library in Potsdam, one of Victoria's private diaries was unearthed decades later. In it, she wrote of her son, not with bitterness, but with grief. She confessed that she had tried too hard, perhaps too forcefully, to mold him into something he could never become. She feared her strength had become his resistance. Her intellect, his burden, her love, misunderstood as judgment. She ended one entry with a sentence as simple as it was devastating. I raised a ruler when perhaps he only ever wanted to be a son. That line now rests beneath a quiet plaque in a small exhibit on the fall of German monarchies. There is no monument to Wilhelm in Berlin, but Victoria's words have been read by more eyes than his proclamations ever reached. Time does not grant justice, it grants clarity. And in that clarity, their story endures. Not as celebration, but as mirror. The mother who warned of arrogance, the son who mistook warning for betrayal, the empire that mistook ambition for destiny, and the world that forgot them both until it remembered why they mattered. For in the end, Victoria did not outlive the empire, but her voice did. It echoed through wars, through ruins, through silence. Not in power, but in permanence,